Good afternoon. My name is Adriana Link, and I'm the head of scholarly programs here at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to today's virtual discussion with Kelly Weiskopf, who will be talking about her new and very excellent book, Assembled for Use, Indigenous Compilations and the Archives of Early Native American Literatures, which is now out from Yale University Press, and we'll share the link in the chat. To begin, I will share a little bit about where I'm joining you from today. The American Philosophical Society resides in what is now known as Philadelphia, which is in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. In recognizing this, the Society expresses its thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of the Lenape, as well as that of numerous other Indigenous communities and individuals throughout the continent who have offered guidance, expertise, correction, and opportunities for collaboration. Their generosity makes the work of the Society's Library and Museum possible. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, www.amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. Today's program is sponsored by the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. The center is a permanent department at the APS's Library and Museum that works with Indigenous communities throughout the continent, who are a primary constituency, and with campus and community-based scholars in many disciplines and traditions. And we'll share information on how you can connect with CNR as well. We're using Zoom webinar for today's discussion, so not to worry, you've all been muted. If you have a question, however, please use the Q&A button at the bottom center of your navigation bar. We really encourage you to type your question at any time during today's discussion. There'll be plenty of time at the end of the presentation for questions with our speaker. We're also excited to offer closed captioning for today's virtual discussion. If you would like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It is to the right of the Q&A button. With that, I am very pleased to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Kelly Weiskopf is Associate Professor of English at Northwestern University. She is the author of Medical Encounters, Knowledge and Identity in Early American Literatures, and Assembled for Use, Indigenous Compilation and the Archives of Early Native American Literatures. She's also the editor of Good News from New England by Edward Winslow, a scholarly edition, and co-editor with Lisa Brooks of Plymouth Colony, Narratives of English Settlement and Native Resistance from the Mayflower to King Philip's War, which will be coming out later this year. Her work has been supported by fellowships from the Newberry Library, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, and of course, the American Philosophical Society. So with that, I am very excited to welcome Kelly. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Adriana, for that introduction and for the invitation to be with you today. I am coming to you today from the very snowy homelands of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Ho-Chunk, Miami, and Menominee nations. And the snow is coming down outside my window. So I hope you are all warm and safe. I want to start just by saying thanks to Adriana and the APS for this invitation to give this talk. And I'm especially grateful to the reading room staff and the staff in archives for assistance when I spent several summers at the APS doing part of the research for this book. I'm really grateful as well to Brian Carpenter and the late Timothy Powell for conversations about the book in its early stages, and to Brian for help toward its ending stages as well. I'm also seeing in the participant list lots of folks who are colleagues and students and a college roommate, all of whom I'm glad to see or not see, I guess, kind of virtually. I wish we were together in person, but thanks so much for coming today. So today I want to introduce you to my book, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I want to introduce you to my book by describing its key terms, sharing some of the moments and archives that crystallized my questions about and thinking about those terms, talking about how I hope the book is generative for the fields of early Native studies and early American studies, and then concluding with a little piece from the book that demonstrates its argument. So this book, Assembled for Use, had its origins in archival research and in questions that archival materials posed that I didn't initially have answers for. And so I want to open by talking about two such moments. One began the project in 2011 when I was at Dartmouth College reading in the Samson Occom papers. I was then working on a book about medical knowledge, and so I read Occom's Herbs and Roots. This is a manuscript booklet of medicinal recipes that Occom wrote when he was living and serving the Native community on Montauk on Long Island in the early 1750s. So just to kind of situate you in terms of Occom's life, he has left the white minister, Eliezer Wheelock, with whom he'd been studying theology and other subjects for the past few years. And he'd responded to a call from Montauk to be a teacher there. Occom and other Mohegan people had longstanding ties at Montauk. And so the response to that call was in part a response to those ties. I was initially really flummoxed by the recipes. The numbered recipes, which you can see in the middle image here, place the names for plants next to the names of maladies that in Occom's words, they're good for treating. But they don't include sentences, and they seem sometimes not to offer instructions, at least to my eyes. Alongside the recipes, Occom jotted accounts that tallied expenses for things like books, powder and shot, and plowing. And you can see this on the far left image. He wrote a brief journal entry and drafted a letter, and you can see some of those pieces in the image on the far right. In addition, the recipe books exist in two pieces and at two places, with one booklet at Dartmouth and the other in Connecticut at the New London County Historical Society. So the recipes raised a host of questions for me. How was one to read the recipes if recipes were the kind of thing a literary scholar should read? And how might Occom and others have read them? What was I to make of the fact that the recipes lived in two archives and included fragments like the accounts, journal entry, and letter? Something that surprised me, given that recent editions of Occom's work didn't include those fragments and reordered the essays so that they look like one cohesive text. How did the recipes fit into Occom's body of work? He's known for his best-selling sermon, his autobiographies are regularly anthologized, and scholars have written about his political petitions, his hymns, and his journals, all part of groundbreaking scholarship on early Native literatures. But scholars tended to read the recipes as contextual documents, as useful for helping us to understand the history of Occom's work as a writer, a minister, and one of the founders of the Brothertown Indian Nation. So I wondered, what place did the recipes have in early Indigenous literary histories? Over the course of the last decade or so of research, I came to appreciate moments like this one, when a text disorients what I think I know and my methods for reading, and asks me to start from a perspective of uncertainty and openness to the text. My questions about Occom's recipes attuned me to a pattern that I began to see in additional research. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Indigenous people were making manuscript and printed texts by assembling disparate textual materials, from individual words to longer excerpts and sometimes images. In the case of the recipes, Occom gathered together medicinal and environmental knowledge with Mohegan words and instructions for use alongside the accounts and journals. These texts, made by intentional assemblage and juxtaposition, have a reputation as utilitarian, as works that store information for future use, as texts that decontextualize and isolate information. So they've remained on the sidelines both of Native studies and of literary studies, assumed to have uses but not to elicit readings, to serve as a portal to the past for scholars, but not to have had readers in their own time. But the assembled texts I was reading in archives fit awkwardly in these assumptions. They often bore the signs of readers and of capacious uses, and their makers created a whole host of fascinating new meanings for the materials that they were arranging on the page. So I came to call these texts Indigenous Compilations. This is a term that allows me to attend to the relation-making functions of forms like recipes, lists, catalogs, albums, account books, and scrapbooks. By relation-making, I mean the ways that practices of juxtaposition and assemblage can create relationships by placing textual excerpts and pieces into proximity on a page. The term Indigenous compilation also allows me to emphasize that the act of making a compilation was one of experimentation, with the different kinds of arrangements that might be made out of pieces of text and the meanings that might emerge from their relations. So just to give you a sense of what some of these texts are, in addition to recipes, Indigenous compilations extend to manuscript and printed texts that extract and rearrange excerpts from manuscripts, newspapers, and other printed texts. And we can think here about the Pequot activist William Apus's work to reprint excerpts of newspaper articles about the Mashpee Wampanoag people's resistance to colonist theft of their timber in the 1830s. Apus juxtaposed those excerpts with his own comments, which would expose their duplicity or inaccuracy or point to their support for Mashpee. I also include here the Potawatomi writer Simon Mulcahy's Red Man's Greeting. Mulcahy is excerpting and rewriting Washington Irving's History of Columbus, and he's doing so in order to critique celebratory narratives of Columbus that were circulating at the World's Fair held in Chicago in 1893. Indigenous compilations also include albums and scrapbooks, and we can think here of the poetry albums curated by the Ojibwe woman Charlotte Johnston in the 1820s and 1830s, in which her friends and acquaintances transcribed original and published poems as tokens of their friendship or to mark special occasions. They also include scrapbooks of newspaper articles kept in the late 19th and early 20th century by people like the Yavapai physician and activist Carlos Montezuma and the Seneca man Eli S. Parker, who was the first Indigenous Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Both men are using their scrapbooks to track and recontextualize the mass media circulation of stereotypical images of Indigenous peoples. And finally, Indigenous compilations include vocabulary lists that arrange words in Indigenous and European languages. One of the defining elements of Indigenous compilations is that they bear material traces of their making and some of their uses within both Indigenous communities and colonial archives. A second archival experience was crucial to helping me understand this point. This one came while I was researching at the American Antiquarian Society, and I'd driven up to Amherst with a few colleagues to take a look at the college's newly acquired Native American literature collection. At the Antiquarian Society, I'd been working with an 1884 book entitled New Familiar Abenakis and English Dialogues. It's a grammar, vocabulary lists, and dialogues in English and Abenaki, and it's written by the Odanak Abenaki leader, Joseph Laurent. Amherst had just acquired a copy of the dialogues, and the special collections librarian, Mike Kelly, heard we were visiting and suggested that I consult it. This was a moment when I realized that the story of the dialogues took place both on its pages and in its travels to various spaces. So I opened up the book, and pasted into the front cover is this postcard. It advertises a camp that Laurent helped to run in the 1880s and 1890s in a place called Pequawket, which is also known as Intervale, New Hampshire. It's in the White Mountains. During the summers, Abenaki people traveled from Odanak in Quebec across the US-Canada border to return to homelands from which some of their ancestors had fled colonial violence in the 17th and 18th centuries. And they sold items like baskets and other objects valued by tourists as souvenirs. The summers in the camp were also a time to visit and renew relations with other Abenaki people living within the United States. The postcard stands as material evidence of these travels and relations. A few years later, I began research at the Newberry Library by opening up that library's copy of the dialogues and finding an envelope pasted into its front cover. This envelope indicates that Laurent sent that copy to the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington, D.C. He addresses it to the chief clerk. This is a man named James Pilling, who at the time is engaged in a massive linguistic collecting project in which he's obtaining copies of Indigenous language books and word lists to create a bibliography that grew to such lengths that it had to be published piecemeal in smaller volumes. So why, I wondered, was Joseph Laurent sending copies of his word list to a center of ethnographic collection and knowledge production? As Pilling was collecting lists of Indigenous words, the Bureau was using those lists to, as the director John Wesley Powell put it, fix Indigenous people in place by determining how to group and from time to time assemble them on reservations. Why might Laurent decide to engage with the same textual forms, the word list, that in these officials' hands transformed Indigenous peoples, literatures, and languages into objects of study and bounded political entities they could locate within the boundaries of the US? And finally, How did the copy of the dialogues at the Newberry and its travels to the Bureau complement or contrast how the copy now at Amherst was being used by Abenaki people at Odanak and Pequawket? Research at the APS turned out to be really essential to answering this last set of questions, and I'll come back to this in a moment. These copies of the dialogues and the material evidence they hold for their uses and circulations helped me bring together the two narratives that structure the book. First, the chapters offer detailed readings of how Indigenous compilations were made and used in 5 communities, from Occom's Herbs and Roots in 1754 to Simon Pokagon's Red Man's Greeting at the end of the 19th century. I examine the materials assembled on the page, from medicinal recipes to elements of tribal histories, to Indigenous language words or poems and hymns and articles clipped from newspapers. And I track down the sources from which those materials came to illuminate how Indigenous writers gave those materials new meanings within their compilations. So if we go back to Occom's recipes, what seemed to me to be at first disconnected phrases emerged as the elements of a place-specific vocabulary of plants and illnesses. Arranging those elements on the page allowed Occom to represent and see at a glance the relationships among herbs and roots, the maladies they could treat, and bodily symptoms, and then to make an appropriate concoction. The space of the page, rather than the unit of the sentence, and medicinal relationships among plants and disease and bodies, rather than paragraphs and figurative language, oriented the recipes. Or we could think too about the compilations of the Cherokee lawyer John Ridge, who's pictured here on the right. I discuss him in chapter 2 and talk about how in the mid-1820s, Ridge assembled and analyzed extracts from European histories, state of Georgia documents, religious periodicals, and query lists to create an account of the Cherokee Nation's sovereignty at a moment when the state of Georgia was threatening to disregard and trample that sovereignty, insisting that its citizens had the right to settle on Cherokee lands. Ridge called this work of assembling such excerpts opening them for his use, that is, opening colonial histories and European legal tracts for his interpretation and analysis through a lens of Cherokee history and legal sovereignty. In addition to reading the materials compiled on the page and tracing their origins, the book follows compilations, circulations, and uses within Indigenous communities. Reading a compilations page gave rise to a range of uses that include and often go beyond the page. And throughout the process, talking with tribal historians, scholars, and artists helped me understand some of the uses for these compilations in the past, as well as their present uses and afterlives. For instance, when I read Occom's recipes alongside his journals for the 1780s, I saw that moments when he was called to treat a malady or provide assistance in the case of an illness often facilitated conversations about forming what became the Brothertown Indian Nation. This is the Indigenous community that Occom helped to found with the aim of securing lands that would be safe from colonial dispossession and influence. Using the recipes to treat a body facilitated conversations about the kinds of relations Indigenous communities in the Northeast might form with each other, about the kind of body politic, as Occom put it, that they might be. We can also think here about the ways that Laurent's word lists and dialogues in Abenaki invite readers to pass the book back and forth as they speak the words. The book's dialogues and word lists generate acts of reading the page, as well as speaking words in several languages and sharing and handling the book as a material object. The signature of Laurent's daughter, Octavie, which you can see on the right here, in the copy held at Amherst, gives us a glimpse into one of the book's owners who might have used her copy in this way. The range of actions that Indigenous compilations generated and the ways they position reading and use as interrelated lets me account for the actions of people like Octavie who participated in making and using compilations, but who've not figured on scholarship in Native literatures because they don't do the work of an author or editor. And so here, I hope the book is useful for conversations about early Native literary histories, which have been made possible by recent decades of recovery work that's made Native people's writing accessible. So we can think here of the wonderful editions of work by people like Samson Occom, William Apess, Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, and many others. One emphasis in this scholarship has been on the author, both as a category of recovery and in the 19th century as an important legal status tied to copyright that allowed Native writers to own and control their own work. And this legal status is especially important because of the traditions of settlers appropriating Indigenous identities and words. And work by Phil Deloria, Jeannie O'Brien, and Phil Round has talked about how this works through playing Indian or through making claims of firstness. I build on this prior authorship in early Native literary studies that's oriented around authors, even as I expand it to consider people who participated in making Indigenous literatures and did so by reading and using texts. In addition to following Indigenous compilations within Indigenous communities, the book follows compilations as they travel to archives and libraries within the US, where most of them reside today. And this is the second narrative of the book. As the case of Laurent's dialogue suggests, Indigenous compilations traveled to the archives where they now reside because of a deliberate decision on the part of their maker to send a compilation to an archive or to engage with an antiquarian or an ethnographer who is seeking information about Native peoples. These decisions were made in a range of contexts. They include giving a book as a gift, selling a book or a manuscript out of financial need, and coercive contexts in which Indigenous writers are attempting to change how settler officials treated and represented their communities. So one of the aha moments in the book came when I mapped out the dates for Indigenous compilations alongside the dates for the founding of US archives, libraries, and museums. And this is the timeline that eventually emerged. It's also from the opening pages of the book. This kind of mapping helped me see that Indigenous compilations were being made and traveling into archives during a period when national and local archives were being founded and expanded in the United States, and a period when settlers saw collecting Indigenous literatures and words as essential to preserving the continent's history, understanding its past, and predicting its future. I know these slides are a lot to take in at a glance, and especially on a PowerPoint, so let me see if I can set this context briefly. We can date one catalyst for the proliferation of US archives to Thomas Jefferson's call in the 1780s in Notes on the State of Virginia for people to collect lists of Indigenous words and place them into libraries. Anticipating Native communities' imminent disappearance, and you can see the kind of convoluted passive voice and weird verb tenses that Jefferson is using here to anticipate this disappearance, he's envisioning that libraries would soon be the only places where white settlers would be able to encounter Native people. Now, of course, that disappearance did not and has not happened, but in the meantime, settlers created massive paper collections of Indigenous stories, histories, word lists, and diplomatic communications, and committees to study them and libraries to store them. One of the insights that came out of my research at the APS was that many times these projects to collect, categorize, and study Indigenous peoples didn't result in a set of coherent, much less accurate, ethnographic or historical theories. More often, what collectors produced was more paper and more documentation. And we can see this in Peter Duponceau's word lists here. He's recopying and collating various separate documents that have been sent to the APS and putting them into one bound book. And you can see from the title page on the left that the book is itself reused from other purposes. What Duponceau is trying to do is to see the list from different sources in one place, to be able to compare them at a glance or as he leafs through the book. These archives of Indigenous peoples and their languages generated a thickening materiality, a paper record. And this material thickness had the effect of thickening those readings' social weight as well. And so the book thinks through how these archival representations of Indigenous peoples gained authority through repeated citation, copying, and publication. As Indigenous people sent a compilation into an archive or agreed to reply to a query from a settler ethnographer, they put colonial knowledge production under analysis, exposing the faulty assumptions on which that knowledge rested and its consequences for Indigenous peoples. So we can return here to the copy of the dialogues that Laurent sent to James Pilling at the Bureau of American Ethnology. The APS's collections of the papers of Laurent's son, Stephen, were essential for understanding Laurent's decision to send a copy of the dialogues to the Bureau. Stephen gave speeches about his father and Abenaki history to historical societies in the 1970s and 80s. And one of those speeches, he wrote that the camp at Pequawket became a nucleus for Indian scholars seeking out the chief whose grammar dictionary had become known. Stephen explained that one of those Indian scholars was Frank Speck, the Penn anthropologist who apparently returned several times to Laurent, attempting to gather information to define what Speck was calling ethnic categories. Speck's repeated questions and revisions prompted an exchange that Stephen describes here. As he says, his father smiled and said, "Well, Dr. Speck, I hope that I'll live long enough to find out before I die just what kind of Indian I am." Laurent's teasing remark here hints at his sense of the fault lines in the categories that Speck was using to locate Indigenous people in various identity-related and historical categories. And it suggests that Laurent's replies to Speck might have prompted the anthropologist's revisions. In this light, we can see Laurent's decision to send a copy of the dialogues to Pilling as a move that likewise disrupts and exposes the Bureau's use of linguistic collecting to locate Native people in one place and to treat word lists as historical artifacts rather than as living documents that are useful in the present. So by following Indigenous compilations into colonial archives, the book tells an early chapter in the history of Indigenous peoples' interactions with and criticism of US archives and museums, a story that's more often been located in the important archival activism of the 20th and 21st centuries. I look back to these interventions at moments of archival founding and proliferation before their specialization and centralization into disciplines and academic departments, to follow how Indigenous compilations created critical perspectives on colonial archives as they traveled into those spaces. Indigenous peoples treated these archives not just as repositories of historical records and memory, but also as what the Native Studies scholar Audra Simpson calls scenes of apprehension, places that produce representations and that define how we know things and the questions we ask about the past. By sending a compilation into an archive, Indigenous compilers insisted on reading those colonial representations of Indigenous peoples with a perspective attuned to their effects on Indigenous communities and the central place of Indigenous peoples' sovereignty and relation to their homelands. Throughout the book, I ask what the ramifications of this engagement with colonial archives might be for scholars of Native literatures, and I consider how scholars might learn from and follow the critical perspective on archives that Indigenous compilers fostered. So I want to bring these narrative threads together and demonstrate how I think through these questions in a little bit more detail. And so I want to conclude with a story from the book that demonstrates first how Indigenous compilations function as relation-making texts, and two, how they generate critical perspectives on colonial knowledge production. So here I want to return us to the two albums kept by the Ojibwe woman Charlotte Johnston between 1826 and about 1833. Johnston is the daughter of the Ojibwe woman Ojibwe, and this illustration of her is from the APS. And she's also the daughter of the Irish trader John Johnston. The family participates in Ojibwe kinship and trading networks from their home and trading posts at the Ojibwe place Bawating, which is also called Sault Ste. Marie. And you can see from this map that the Sault Ste. Marie is at this kind of critical geographic place in the Great Lakes. It's on a river that connects the eastern and the western Great Lakes. And so it connects the kind of western part of the continent to eastern waterways that flow to the Atlantic. Charlotte is also a sister to the well-known poet Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, who's often described as the first Indigenous person to write poetry in English. And she is also a sister-in-law to Jane's very prolific husband, the Indian agent and ethnographer Henry Rose Schoolcraft. But unlike her famous sister, Charlotte has not featured in histories of Native literature, and she's rarely mentioned in histories of the Indigenous Great Lakes. I think this is in part because her engagement with writing in English does not privilege originality or authorship, and because many of her acts entailed speaking and singing in Anishinaabe-Moan, and transcribing those actions in writing did not seem to be a priority for Johnston. Her actions often evade colonial documentation. Some white ministers for whom she's translating sermons in the early 1830s commented on those translations, noting that she continued past their sermons to give her own address, but because they didn't speak the language, those addresses remained beyond their comprehension. And many of Johnston's acts of sharing poetry and songs were enmeshed in acts of providing hospitality and care to other Ojibwe people, acts that to British tourists and to her own brother-in-law looked like wasted time. And so this is how they describe those actions in their writing. In the book chapter, I read these accounts of Johnston to understand the ways that government officials and tourists sought to interpret and categorize Johnston herself in the songs she circulated. And I also read them against the grain and alongside Johnston's albums to locate the traces of her literary exchanges. I examine how the albums generate acts that sustain relations among Ojibwe people and that contested the frameworks that colonists were applying to Johnston and her compilations. So to see how this works, let me talk a little bit about the albums. Johnston kept 2 albums, one containing about 80 previously published poems and some illustrations that friends and acquaintances inscribed on its pages, and the second containing hymns, prayers, and religious poetry in both English and Anishinaabe-Moan. A few of the poems are original compositions by family members and friends, and more often the poems are copied from newspapers or other sources. Instead of originality, the albums privilege and generate acts of sharing texts, which stand as tokens of friendship, affection, and creative exchange. The album entitled Charlotte Johnston's Ojibwe Book contains clusters of hymns in Anishinaabe-Moan, including several like this one, signed by Ojibwe ministers who were stopping at the Sioux and lodging with the Johnstons on their way farther west into Lake Superior. These hymns reflect the ways that singing produced contributions to the albums and the ways the albums themselves supported singing as a form of community making. Several ministers and other visitors to the Sioux described Johnston as having a sweet singing voice and as someone who had a close bond through her singing with other Ojibwe people, including her relatives on her mother's side who lived in the region. They write that she spoke their language, had their affection, and knew their feelings. Singing and sharing hymns seems to have been one way that Johnston shared and held the affection of other Ojibwe people. One minister observed that Johnston and the visiting Ojibwe ministers sing sacred music in their own language delightfully. They're teaching others, he wrote. They passed Saturday afternoon at Mrs. Johnston's in singing. Singing was also one avenue through which Johnston engaged the US officials, soldiers, and Indian agents who began traveling to her home beginning in the mid-1820s. Some of these men came as representatives of the US's claims to the region. These remained only paper claims at the moment. This is still a place that's an Ojibwe place, and the US doesn't really have any control over it. Other of these men traveled as government officials who were seeking land cessions and alliances with Ojibwe nations. These officials frequently received the hospitality that the Johnstons provided, and it seems to have been in some of these contexts that some of them added poems or illustrations to Johnston's second album, which is Untitled. At the same time, these US officials often made these contexts of hospitality into instances for gathering information about Ojibwe peoples that they could take back to centers of collection and knowledge production like Washington, DC. So this is an instance in which Johnston's making a compilation at the same time that settlers are seeing her as an object they wish to collect and possess. And I think these desires for possession have both ethnographic and sexual undertones. One government official requested that Johnston visit him in DC alone, a request that her father denied. And several soldiers apparently wished to propose to her, even going so far as to try to ruin the reputation of the man that she eventually was engaged to and married. And I think we can see these desires as manifesting the relationships between possessing Indigenous lands and possessing Indigenous women's bodies that scholars like Leanne Simpson and Diane Millian have described, and that, as Millian puts it, is a mobile but durable feature of colonial power relations. These acts of compilation and desired possession come together in the multiple versions of a poem about an Ojibwe maid that appears throughout Johnston's albums and a few other publications. This is a poem that tells the story of a young Ojibwe woman grieving for a young American man. She, in the song, mourns over the stream along which she used to paddle to see her, crying tears at their parting. In some versions, the last stanza has the Ojibwe woman suggest that the young man will find new loves and will soon forget her. A number of people are engaged in collecting versions of this poem in the summer of 1826. Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Thomas McKenney, reported that Charlotte and Jane transcribed the poem for him in Anishinaabe-Moan and English in both a verse and free translation. And so you can see the 3 versions that McKinney gathers here. This is in a travel narrative that he publishes on his return to DC. McKinney calls the song a wild flower that he gathered with great care and instructed his correspondent in the narrative, Secretary of War James Barber, not to let it blush unseen or waste any of its sweetness. Rose Schoolcraft also transcribed a version of the song in the Manuscript Literary magazine that he edited with Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. And he also copied that version into Charlotte's album. This is what you see here. As Schoolcraft made clear in commentary that accompanied his version, he saw the song less as a flower that needed to be appreciated before it faded, as McKinney did, and more as an ethnographic specimen that provided him with insight into Native women's relation to time. Whether it was McKinney's flower or Schoolcraft's ethnographic specimen, both of the men interpreted the poem about the young Ojibwe woman weeping for a young American and lamenting the bitterness of being loved and left behind as an allegory of Native people's supposed location outside the progressive national time of the US and their fate to be left behind as the US moved into the future. But if McKinney and Schoolcraft read the poem as an allegory of disappearance, there are additional versions in Charlotte's album that complicate these readings and that push us to consider alternate interpretations and uses for the poem. And so we see here another version in Johnston's album, this one from a man who signs his name MacDonald, who was probably accompanying McKinney to treaty negotiations in 1826. MacDonald writes a poem that responds to the Ojibwe woman in the voice of the young American. His concluding stanzas rewrite the end of the Ojibwe Maid as recorded by McKinney and Schoolcraft. For the young man ends by saying, "They fare thee well, I'll ne'er forget the lovely young Ojibwe maid." MacDonald's act of contributing this poem to Johnston's album also enacted this promise of remembrance. And this act signals an understanding of Johnston's performance of the song that departs from those of McKinney and Schoolcraft. In Johnston's album, the song is not a botanical specimen to be plucked, pressed, and displayed as a token of transitory affections and peoples. Instead, it stimulates further interaction, composition, exchange, and conversation. And it draws our attention to the albums as one place, but only one place, where those exchanges were taking place. Finally, Johnston herself transcribed a version of the poem in which she altered the punctuation in the final line of the poem's second stanza. Where McKinney's version ends by lamenting that the woman fears, parting now to meet no more, Johnston moves the punctuation between parting and now, of parting, comma, now to meet no more. This might seem like a very tiny revision, but Johnston's move locates the Ojibwe woman in the now that follows the young man's departure. The revision to the now revises the anticipatory logic of being left behind and of native vanishing to which McKinney and Schoolcraft subscribed. Instead, Johnston's version imagined the future in which the young woman is present and present without the young American. The proliferating versions of the Ojibwe Maid indicate that it would be a mistake to read the song solely as an expression of what Renato Rizal has called imperialist nostalgia, representing settlers' tears for what they've destroyed. Such a reading would limit our focus to the poem's content and occlude their multiple circulations and versions in Johnston's albums. Johnston's albums transformed the Ojibwe Maid from a specimen into a text to be shared, revised, and retranscribed. The multiple versions in her albums show how the song was performed, heard, read, and written back to, carried among friends, and transcribed in new contexts. And in those circulations, it generated new meanings, which were in excess of its content. The acts of sharing poetry in the albums generated further responses and interactions. These aren't separate from the threat of misreading and appropriation that McKinney and Schoolcraft posed, but they aren't determined or assimilated by that threat either, as the albums provide a space for sharing, revising, and circulating poems that exceed these colonial categories and their expectations of vanishing and fading. Johnston's albums transform instances in which colonists sought to make Indigenous women and songs into specimens to preserve in archives and display cases into occasions for multiplying versions of a poem, for repeating and rewriting a song until its original meaning is remade altogether. The albums are spaces in which Johnston experimented, not with how she might adapt to English language poems, but how those entities might be translated to her own ends and for use within Anishinaabe contexts. So I want to conclude by pointing to one way that Johnston's albums continue to generate translations and literary exchange. In the last few years, the Ojibwe poet and translator Margaret Noden, working with a team of students and language experts at the University of Michigan, has translated Johnston's version of the Lord's Prayer in Anishinaabe-Moan, which appears in her Ojibwe book, into contemporary Anishinaabe-Moan orthographies and also into English. You can see these translations in full on the website ojibwe.net, and I've given the link here on the left, and urge you to follow ojibwe.net on Instagram too. It's a site that brings together translations, art, and other pieces related to the Ojibwe language. The retranslations of Charlotte's version of the Lord's Prayer show that she didn't simply replicate the prayer in her translation, but instead took the original as an invitation for creative revision. Rather than emphasizing one supreme deity, Johnston describes a creator along with other powers like the winds and thunderers. And rather than expressing shame for human sinfulness, her version emphasizes human goodness, requesting help for living my life well. The translation emphasizes relationships among the speaker and creator, with entities like winds and thunderers, and with other people. And the contemporary retranslation makes the prayer legible to contemporary Anishinaabe-Moan speakers, while the digital recording gives the prayer voice, circulating it as Johnston might have sung or spoken it with other Anishinaabe people. Johnston's compilations in the albums continue to circulate and continue to generate acts of singing and sharing songs. The digital project at ojibwe.net gives just one glimpse into some of the afterlives for Indigenous compilations. So I'll end there and hope we can continue the conversation with questions. Let me stop sharing. And
great. Thank you so much, Kelly. I cannot express enough how ecstatic I am about this book. So I really encourage everyone, if you haven't already picked up a copy, please take advantage of the generous discount to get your copy. Some really wonderful questions coming in the Q&A, but I guess I wanted to start going back to the start of your talk, where you talk about the origins of this book in your research in Occom's medical recipes, and how that experience really made you rethink what types of things literary scholars can read and analyze in doing their work. And I think you really lean into that in the book, and I love the different examples that you give. But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you came to those texts. How did you choose these objects, these materials that you discuss throughout the book? And how do those choices help frame the arguments that you make about their creation and use?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I tried really hard to find this photograph of a cart at the American Antiquarian Society that was full of vocabulary lists of Indigenous language words. At one point, I think it was Ashley Cataldo pulled out, it must have been like several hundred vocabulary lists on this cart. It was like the last day of my fellowship, and one of those moments where you just realize like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to have time to get through this. So, you know, there was a definite period where I was just working through and trying to think through what is the range of compilations, what is out there, and how can I sort of make my way through this archive. And so really the works that I chose to work with in the book emerge because of the ways that they bear the kind of material traces of their uses in Indigenous communities and colonial archives. And so they could help me tell the story of their circulation and their uses for Indigenous peoples, and also their travels to colonial archives. And you know, I think it's important to remember that not every book in an archive gets there because somebody decided that it was important or valuable or needed to be kept. There's plenty of accidental, and thankfully for us in the present, I guess, accidental saving and happenstance that gets text to archives. But I was really interested in the story and trying to figure out, you know, why it was that Indigenous people were deciding to engage with these archives that were making these inaccurate claims about their communities, and basically telling the story of vanishing that was really belied by the very active writing and activism that Native people are doing in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so I wanted to bring together a set of texts that would help me tell that story. And these sets of texts were important not just for the kind of material traces they offered, but also because they helped me tell a story about an archive or a collector who is often seen as kind of crucial to the history of archives or anthropology in the United States. So they really helped me think about the ways that early Indigenous literatures intersect with and comment on the kind of prehistory of anthropology, even as I think like one effect or consequence of their position in archives is that subject headings and categories and ethnographers' commentary has tended to erase or altogether or to downplay the interventions that Native people were making into those archives. In the case of Samson Occom is a really good example. There's a entry for him in James Pilling's bibliography that kind of astounded me when I first came across it. And Pilling writes, Occom, Samson, see Jonathan Edwards. And so then we go to Jonathan Edwards and we see that Pilling is interested in the copy of Occam's sermon that Edwards has donated somewhere. So this moment where Occom is present in this bibliography, but very quickly subsumed into a heading for this famous Puritan minister, I think was really telling for me for the ways that these interventions in archives were happening, but archival categories were effacing and covering over those interventions. And so I wanted to try to work with texts that would tell both of those stories.
That's great. And there's a question here that I think is a nice follow-up. So kind of thinking about the different multiple copies of the text that you looked at in the course of doing this research, could you reflect on how discoverable the interleaved and pasted in materials are from the online catalogs and the archives that you worked in? And more generally, how helpful is the apparatus of the research library for finding Indigenous literature more broadly?
I would say pretty helpful, actually. So the Newberry's listing for the Laurent copy of their copy of Laurent's dialogues does list the envelope that's been pasted in. When I looked at the Amherst copy, I think it actually hadn't been cataloged yet. So I have not looked at their catalog record very recently. So I'm actually not sure what information it contains, but I do know that Amherst has been working on this kind of project of indigenizing their catalog entries. And so I would not be surprised if the information about the postcard was in that catalog. So in some ways, catalogs do make this present. And I think that's due to the work of archivists and librarians who have really worked to make the actions of Indigenous peoples visible in their catalog headings. In other cases, I would say they'd be less visible. So for instance, my work with John Ridge's letter to Albert Gallatin came about really circuitously. It's cataloged at the New York Historical Society in a catalog heading for Indigenous languages. And Ridge does send Gallatin a word list, but his letter is actually not just about Indigenous languages and really hardly about Indigenous languages. It's also the case that Ridge wrote a draft of that letter that's held at the Newberry, and the New York Historical Society catalog entry doesn't mention that other copy. So in part, it felt like I was trying to work from what was present in the catalogs, but also to stitch back together the stories of these texts that have been separated and sent to different archives. We can think too about the way that Occam's recipes actually exist in two different places. So trying to stitch the stories of those texts back together, but also to think about why they ended up in different places and what story that might actually tell about the work of Indigenous compilers and the decisions they're making to send their texts into different places. So it is a story of colonial archives sort of taking and categorizing and in some ways separating texts, but it's not just a story of loss. There's a story of Indigenous action and decision-making and kind of strategic advocacy and intervention there that the disparate kind of archival map of the book is telling as well.
A couple of great questions here about the term compilation and compilations. And I particularly like this one from Paul Tufo, who asks if you have a working term for what we call the people who did this kind of generative and representational work. So I think you just said compilers in response to my question, but wondering if compilationists is another term. So eager to hear more on compilation as a term.
That's a great question. I think I use compilers in the book itself. I also try to pay attention to the language that Indigenous compilers and writers are using themselves to describe their work. So John Ridge saying, I'm opening up this text to my use. William Apis talks about extracting from colonial histories. And he says something about not following the order that colonial histories, he says something like, my appendix to my autobiography doesn't have the order that a colonial history does. And so rather than read that as Apis saying like, this is a kind of fault of the appendix and of his work, I read this actually as Apis rejecting the kind of order and narrative structure of those histories and saying extracting is actually this really productive activity that I'm going to do in order to see what these histories are kind of hiding. So I pay attention to the language that Indigenous people are using to describe their actions. Compilation was also an important term to me for the ways that it got at these acts of assembling. But if you look at the etymology of the word, it's a word whose history includes meaning both a kind of bringing together and piling together of pieces, but it can also refer to plunder and to theft. And so compilation let me think about the ways that Indigenous writing in the 18th and 19th centuries was this act of compiling and assembling and juxtaposing pieces together that was often happening in these contexts of theft and plunder, where settlers are attempting to take, to purchase, to steal Indigenous histories, material belongings, and languages and move them to archives. And so compilation as a term let me get at kind of the action and the context in which it was happening.
That's great. And I think really lends nicely to a question that Molly Hardy is asking, particularly in response to the compilation categorization for authorities in DC, and how this relates to earlier traditions of sort of texts being circulated back to colonial outposts about Indigenous peoples. So does the story sort of move across different historical periods? Or as she asks, do we do a disservice if we move your very helpful theoretical framework to different centuries and material contexts?
Hi, Molly. Thanks for that question. Talking with Molly about cataloging and categorizing at the Antiquarian Society was really helpful to my thinking. So thanks for this question. I thought a lot about those 17th century dictionaries and texts, and the project began or has like an origin that is probably not ever going to become anything, trying to think about the 17th century and those word lists and acts of collecting. And I think they're useful for understanding Indigenous people's knowledge of a textual form like a word list. These are not new in the 18th century. We see from some of the earliest English incursions on Abenaki lands, the creation of word lists as colonists try to, promote settlement, as they try to claim a kind of transparency of communication. And they're doing this in the case of James Rosier, whose text I'm thinking about. This is like 1605 or 1607. He's making this word list by working with Abenaki men that have been kidnapped and taken captive by the English and are being taken back to England. So there's a long history here of texts like word lists and other, we could say, documentary or bureaucratic forms being used in the service of colonization. And that's true, in North America and South America very, very early. So I think what we see happening in the 18th century is a kind of decision to use these forms and to remix and revise them and to grapple with the ways that they are being kind of founding these archival foundings and expansions, but also to grapple with that long history of extraction and kidnapping and colonization that these lists have been part of. And so part of the book was trying to think through the ways that we need to account for that history as part of these texts' literary legacy and genealogy, but also that Indigenous compilers are doing something different with them, and we need to understand that as well. So I'm not fully answering Molly's question. What I hope is portable about Indigenous compilations beyond the 18th and 19th centuries is the way that I hope it helps us look at texts that are not narrative, that maybe do not prioritize authorship and originality, that are made through juxtaposition and assemblage, and that it maybe helps us not assume that those texts are simply historical context, but that they are part of these Indigenous literary histories across the Americas. and to think as well about what they're doing within Indigenous communities as a kind of important part of their making and use and afterlives. And I think that, I hope that can be applied to other contexts and centuries.
It's a question here from Paul Lashway specifically about settler colonial reactions to Occom's recipes. But I'm wondering if you've had an opportunity to kind of trace the different reactions from settlers to the compilations that you talk about through your story. I mean, I know that the last example that you give in the chapter about the 1893 Chicago World's Fair the title is either The Red Man's Greeting or Rebuke.
Yeah.
It's sort of published with both titles. So I'd love to hear you kind of talk more about those strategic decisions and any sort of work you've done on reception and reaction to these texts.
I think this is a really important question, especially as it relates to the argument that the book is making about Indigenous peoples' interventions into archives. And one of the things I say in the introduction and across the book is that the responses to these interventions varied. There are some cases in which people changed how they were writing about Indigenous people. And we can think about the example about Frank Speck that I gave with regard to Joseph Laurent earlier in the talk, where Speck is actually trying to revise the categories that he's coming up with and kind of realizing that he's not getting it quite right. But there are many other moments where we can actually see settlers ignoring the work of an Indigenous compiler or proceeding with an argument that they kind of already have in mind. The case of John Ridge is a good example. So in 1825, Albert Gallatin sends Ridge a list of queries about Cherokee people. And Ridge takes a couple of months to write back. He writes back in early 1826. And Ridge is clearly both kind of answering Gallatin's queries and at the same time rejecting the logic of them, refusing to answer some of the questions, showing the ways in which the question is kind of bogus and ridiculous to begin with, and really kind of rewriting the very premise of what Gallatin is asking him. Gallatin kind of holds out the possibility of publication in Europe for Ridge. He's corresponding, Gallatin is, with Humboldt, Alexander Humboldt at the time, but nothing seems to come of the exchange on Gallatin's part. He kind of summarizes Ridge's work in a letter to Humboldt, but otherwise effaces Ridge's name and work from his subsequent publications. And Gallatin kind of proceeds with his assumptions about Cherokee and other Indigenous peoples in his later publications. So I think this is a case where we can actually see that the intervention sometimes is ignored by a colonist. Somebody just decides, like, they're proceeding with their assumptions about Indigenous peoples anyway. And I think we see this. There'd be many examples that we could see today of this, and I could think about the debate about, or the conversation about mascots and the ways that everybody from psychologists to historians and literary scholars have shown that mascots based on Indigenous imagery are harmful to Indigenous kids, and people proceed with that knowledge anyway. So this is not specific to the 18th and 19th centuries. So on the one hand, we see interventions kind of trying to reconfigure the forms of colonial knowledge production, and that's sometimes working and also sometimes being ignored. In the case of Occom's recipes, I don't have a sense exactly of how colonists are responding to the recipes, but I do have a sense of the ways that they respond to Occom's account of his time at Montauk. And that's through kind of tracing the publication and republication of Occom's kind of journal account of his time at Montauk, and where it's sort of recast in light of Occom's work with Eleazar Wheelock as opposed to his relations with Mohegan. So I guess another thing that happens is Indigenous interventions are cast through colonial frameworks rather than being understood through these frameworks of Indigenous community and relation making that are so important to Indigenous compilations.
We're very quickly running out of time, and there's so many great questions I wish we could talk about. But I do want to make sure that we touch on this last one from Julia Stern, which talks specifically about the kind of ethical dimension to your book, and you talk in the end about how the relationality that goes into doing this work. Would love to hear more about your experiences in making the connections that are kind of driving the underlying narrative of this book. And if you can sort of offer some lessons for others who are maybe interested in doing this work as well.
Yeah. Julia Stern is my dear colleague at Northwestern. So hello, Julia, thanks for coming and thanks for this question. So one of the things I did across my research process was to talk with members of the Indigenous communities from which the compilations come. And those people varied. They were tribal leaders, they were tribal historic preservation officers, they were scholars, they were artists. It tended to be a little bit different in terms of each community. And those were conversations about compilations, about the people who wrote them, about the uses that those compilations might play in the past, but also for the present. And I often found that those conversations changed my questions. I was sometimes on one track and they would quickly put me on another track where I'd realize how that my assumptions about something were really off. So they were moments that kind of like the texts themselves, challenged what I thought I knew and my methods for reading. And they also helped me think about my place as a non-native scholar of Native literatures in colonial archives and in working with Indigenous literatures. And for me, the questions that emerged as important there were around my responsibilities for being in those archives and also for the relations with Indigenous communities in the place where I am and in terms of the materials in the book. Some archival collaborations with the American Indian Center of Chicago emerged out of my thinking about archives. That's a digital project where we worked with an NEH grant to digitize materials in the American Indian Center's archive and make them available to community members and the broader public. And that was really important for me in thinking through how archives are relations, they are sets of relations, and thinking about what kind of role I might have in those relations. And sometimes that role was to help organize a project, and sometimes it was to sit and learn from the people who knew much more about this history than I did. So I really appreciate those moments for helping me kind of understand the import of what I was asking, and also ask this question about responsibility that I don't think I'm done asking, but that I think is a really important question for scholars working in the archives of early America and thinking about the resonances of the past and these archival documents that were made centuries ago and our relationship to them and their importance to the Indigenous communities in which they originated and by whom they were made. Thanks for that question.
Thanks so much, Kelly. And thanks to all of you for these really fantastic questions. I will share them with Kelly after today's program, and perhaps give her an opportunity to answer more. So thank you. Well, with that, I will again plug this really exceptional and beautifully made book. The link is in the chat. So again, if you haven't bought your copy, now is the time. I hope you'll join me from wherever you are in thanking Kelly, and be well, everyone, and see you again soon.
Thanks so much, everybody, for the questions and conversation. And thanks, Adriana and APS. This was really fun.
See you soon.
Bye.